On the morning of September 12, 2025, something remarkable happened in the heart of West Africa. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, the silence of dawn was broken by the steady roar of hundreds of engines. One after another, bulldozers, graders, and heavy trucks came to life. Their sound was not the noise of destruction, but the rhythm of a nation choosing to stand tall. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, only 37 years old, walked to the front of a waiting crowd. There were no fireworks, no red carpets, no polished speeches written by foreign advisors. What stood before him was more powerful. 764 heavy-duty construction machines, bought with the wealth of his own country, handed directly to the people. For decades, families in Burkina Faso had lived with broken roads and bridges washed away by the rains. A mother carrying a sick child could lose hours just trying to reach a clinic. A farmer might watch half his harvest spoil before it ever reached a market. Too many young men and women dreamed only of leaving their homeland because the future felt locked away behind mud, dust, and distance. But that morning, the picture began to change. Those machines were not just steel and rubber. They were a promise that the landlocked nation of Burkina Faso would no longer accept dependence as its destiny. A promise that children would see schools built in their villages, that crops would reach the city, that families would travel safely when storms came. For Africans across the continent, and for people around the world, the sight was unforgettable. It was a moment that said dignity is worth more than comfort, and self-reliance is stronger than borrowed wealth. So tonight, let us walk together through this story. A story of courage, sacrifice, and hope. A story that asks every one of us, no matter where we live, what does it truly mean to live free? In the capital city of Ouagadougou, people gathered from villages near and far. They stood under the hot Sahel sun, some carrying small children on their backs, others holding flags they had sewn by hand. They did not come to see a parade or a concert. They came because they had heard that something rare was about to happen, something that would speak to their dignity as a people. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward, he did not wear a tailored suit. He wore the simple beret that had become a symbol of his leadership. Behind him stood a long line of bulldozers, graders, concrete mixers, and heavy trucks. 764 machines in total, shining in the light, waiting to be put to work. For Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation often described as poor, this moment was extraordinary. These were not donations wrapped in foreign flags. They were not loans from the International Monetary Fund that would bind future generations with debt. Every machine had been purchased with Burkina Faso's own resources, reclaimed from the gold mines that once enriched only outsiders. When Traoré spoke, his words were plain, but they carried weight. He reminded the people that their land was rich, and that for too long others had taken that wealth while families at home struggled. He explained that by renegotiating unfair contracts and demanding that national treasure serve national needs, the government had transformed buried gold into something far more valuable: roads, schools, and clinics. As he handed over the keys to regional representatives, there were cheers from the crowd. But these were not the empty cheers of politics. They were the voices of farmers who dreamed of reaching markets without losing half their harvest. They were the voices of mothers who longed for safe roads to take their children to a hospital when illness struck. They were the voices of students who believed that new roads could carry not only goods, but opportunity and knowledge. In the past, ceremonies in African capitals often followed a script written elsewhere. Smiling officials would thank foreign donors, while citizens knew the aid came with strings attached. This day felt different. It was simple, unpolished, yet deeply powerful. For once, the people were not being told to be grateful for what others had given. They were witnessing their own country stand upright. To the outside world, the machines were just construction equipment. To the people standing in that square, they were proof that sacrifice had meaning, that faith in their own strength was not wasted. It was as if dignity itself had been delivered on wheels, ready to roll out into every corner of the nation. This was the beginning of what Traore called the Faso Mayabo initiative, a vision to build 3,000 to 5,000 kilometers of new roads every year, not only for today, but for generations yet to come. It was a turning point, a statement that Burkina Faso would not wait for permission to build its future. When the engines came to life and the machines were handed over, it was not only leaders in Ouagadougou who felt the weight of that moment. In small towns and distant villages, people began to imagine changes that once seemed impossible. For decades, travel in Burkina Faso had been a test of endurance. In the rainy season, roads turned into rivers of mud. Mothers carried sick children for miles, hoping to reach a clinic before nightfall. Too often, those journeys ended in grief. Families buried little ones who might have lived if only the road had been passable. With the arrival of bulldozers and graders, that sorrow began to lift. A simple road, smooth and firm, meant a mother could reach a doctor in time. It meant a father could take his wife safely to a hospital when complications arose. It meant children had a chance to grow up, not just survive. For the farmer, the change was just as powerful. Many had labored in fields from sunrise to sunset, only to watch their harvest rot before it ever reached the market. Donkeys pulled carts that sank in the sand. Trucks broke down halfway to the city. A year of hard work could vanish on a single road filled with holes. With new machines building reliable paths, crops could reach towns on time, and families could receive a fair price for their labor. That is not only economics, that is justice. It is the reward a man or woman deserves for the sweat of their brow. The impact on the youth was even more striking. For many years, the brightest dream of a young man was not to build at home, but to leave. Some saved money for the dangerous journey north, across deserts and seas, chasing a life in Europe that often ended in tragedy. Now, with machines arriving in their communities, young men and women began to see a different path. They saw training programs for mechanics and operators. They saw jobs that could feed a family, and a purpose that gave dignity. One young man named Idrissa spoke to a local reporter. He admitted he had been preparing to leave for Europe. He had saved money and made plans. But when he saw the graders and trucks rolling into his town, he changed his mind. "If my country is building," he said, "then I want to build too." His words captured the spirit of a generation that finally believed their future could be planted in the same soil where their fathers and mothers had worked. Even in the smallest villages, children noticed the change. They watched the machines with wide eyes, pointing and laughing, as if seeing something magical. Parents told them, "These roads will be yours. These schools will be yours." For the first time in years, families felt they could look their children in the eye and say with honesty, "Tomorrow will be better than today." Faith leaders also spoke with hope. In churches and mosques, sermons echoed with the same message. Dignity sometimes requires sacrifice, but God honors those who stand upright. Pastors reminded their congregations that freedom is a gift worth protecting. Imams urged their communities to work together, saying that the road to justice is built with both faith and labor. It is important to see these changes not only as statistics, but as stories written in the lives of ordinary people. Every kilometer of road meant fewer funerals for children lost to distance. Every bridge meant families could stay together instead of being torn apart by migration. Every new job meant a son or daughter could marry, raise children, and build a future on their own land. This was the meaning of the machines. Not only construction, but connection. Not only movement, but mercy. In the dust of Burkina Faso's villages, families began to believe once more that their sacrifices mattered, and that their children would inherit not despair, but hope. The events in Ouagadougou did not remain within Burkina Faso's borders. News travels fast in the modern world, and within hours videos of farmers standing beside their new machines spread across Africa. For many, it was not only an inspiring sight, it was a challenge. In neighboring Mali and Niger, citizens gathered in markets and cafes, pointing to the images on their phones. They asked aloud why their governments could not achieve the same. These nations share the same struggles: landlocked borders, underdeveloped infrastructure, and a history of being treated as dependent on outside help. If Burkina Faso, smaller and poorer, could turn its own gold into bulldozers and roads, what excuse could others give? The question echoed across the continent. In Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation, students debated late into the night. Nigeria exports vast amounts of oil, yet many rural areas remain cut off by broken roads. How could a nation with so much wealth leave its citizens stranded, while a smaller neighbor found the courage to act? In Ghana and Senegal, opposition leaders seized the moment. They reminded voters that promises of development had too often ended in more debt than progress. They asked their people to look at Burkina Faso, not as a curiosity, but as proof that sovereignty is not a dream. It is a decision. Even in South Africa, the continent's most industrialized nation, the comparison was unavoidable. Commentators noted that billions had been spent on endless projects, yet delays and corruption left many communities still waiting. In contrast, Burkina Faso, with fewer resources, was moving forward with determination. The contrast was sharp, and it carried weight. But the impact was not only political, it was deeply personal. Across Africa, families saw the news and felt a mixture of pride and disappointment. Pride that an African country had dared to act with courage. Disappointment that their own leaders had accepted dependency as normal. Mothers in Nairobi spoke of Traore with admiration, saying that he reminded them of leaders from Africa's past who had put people before foreign approval. Fathers in Lagos told their sons that this was the kind of example they wished their own leaders would follow. For African intellectuals, the symbolism was powerful. Writers compared Traore to Thomas Sankara, the beloved leader who had once called for self-reliance before his life was cut short. Others saw echoes of Patrice Lumumba and Kwame Nkrumah, leaders who dreamed of a continent free from the chains of exploitation. To them, the bulldozers rolling through Burkina Faso were more than machines. They were the continuation of a story interrupted, but never forgotten. What made this moment even more striking was its simplicity. Traore did not announce a grand international alliance or sign a treaty in a foreign capital. He handed over keys in his own city, to his own people, with his own nation's resources. That quiet strength carried a message louder than any speech, and so the comparison became sharper with every passing day. If Burkina Faso, one of the smallest economies on the continent, could stand on its own feet, what excuse remained for nations far richer? Was it truly a lack of resources, or was it a lack of will? This was the ripple effect of September 12th. Not only roads and bridges, but questions that shook parliaments and presidential palaces across Africa. Questions that could no longer be ignored. Questions that reminded everyone that leadership is not measured by how much aid you receive, but by how much dignity you defend. The handover of machines in Ouagadougou may have seemed like a local event, but its echo reached far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In distant capitals, late-night meetings were called. In television studios, analysts debated with nervous voices. In churches and community halls, ordinary people found hope where they had once felt despair. In Europe, Ministers met behind closed doors. Some argued that Burkina Faso's bold move could set a dangerous precedent. They feared that if one small nation could rise without foreign aid, others might follow. Banks that once dictated the pace of African development worried about losing influence. Aid agencies whispered about losing control over the story they had shaped for decades. On television, some commentators dismissed Traoré as reckless. They said he was risking instability, that his people would suffer without the guiding hand of donors. Yet beneath those words was a deeper fear. If Africans discovered that their own resources could finance their dreams, the entire balance of power might shift. In Washington, the reaction was more cautious, but no less uneasy. Officials spoke of stability, partnership, and security. But their private conversations revealed another truth. They understood that what had happened in Ouagadougou was not about bulldozers. It was about a mindset. It was about dignity. And if that mindset spread across the continent, the influence of Washington and its institutions would shrink overnight. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Beijing, and New Delhi, the tone was different. Leaders there moved quickly to extend offers of cooperation. They spoke not of aid, but of partnership. They presented themselves as friends, ready to build side by side, rather than masters offering charity. For many Africans, weary of being treated as dependents, this message resonated. Yet Captain Traoré was careful. He welcomed dialogue, but remained cautious. He knew that replacing one form of dependency with another would betray the very struggle he had begun. His vision was not to trade one master for another, but to restore the ability of his people to walk with dignity, even if the road was rough. Across the Atlantic, in cities like Chicago, Atlanta, and Detroit, African Americans watched the news with special interest. For generations, they had followed the struggles of the continent, often with frustration and sorrow. Too many times, the headlines from Africa spoke of poverty, war, and dependence. But this story was different. Here was a young African leader taking bold steps with his own people's wealth, refusing to bow to outsiders. For many African Americans, this was not only news, it was personal. It was a reminder of dignity long denied, and of the possibility that the land of their ancestors could rise again. Church leaders in the United States spoke of Traoré's decision as a lesson in faith and courage. They told their congregations that freedom always requires sacrifice, and that what was unfolding in Burkina Faso could inspire communities everywhere to demand justice and self-respect. What unsettled policymakers in the West was not military power. It was not even the machines themselves. What unsettled them was the sight of ordinary Africans cheering beside equipment bought with their own resources. That image carried a dangerous message. Africa did not need permission to rise. For decades, the story told to the world was that Africa could not stand without aid. On that September day, Burkina Faso offered a different story, a story of self-reliance, sacrifice, and dignity. And once that story is told, it cannot easily be silenced. The question in Washington, Brussels, and Paris became urgent. Could Burkina Faso survive the storms of pressure long enough to prove that independence was possible? If so, the model might spread like wildfire, and if it spread, the world would never look at Africa the same way again. Inside Burkina Faso, the consequences of Traoré's decision were felt immediately. On the surface, there was celebration, but beneath the joy came challenges that tested the strength of families and communities. Western governments began to apply pressure. Certain medicines became harder to import. Prices of everyday goods rose. Families who were already struggling had to tighten their belts even further. Critics predicted that discontent would soon boil over, that protests would erupt in the streets. But the opposite happened. Instead of division, there was solidarity. In towns and villages, neighbors began to share food with one another. Communities organized networks to make sure no family was left without help. Teachers volunteered extra hours to keep schools running despite shortages. Pastors and imams preached unity from their pulpits, reminding everyone that dignity sometimes requires sacrifice, and that hardship can be endured if carried together. This resilience surprised many outside observers. They expected anger directed at Traoré. Instead, they saw larger crowds gathering to support him. They expected protests demanding a return to dependency. Instead, they saw families lifting one another up, determined to protect their hard-won dignity. Politically, the shift was dramatic. Opposition parties that had long criticized the government found themselves without strong arguments. It is difficult to attack a leader who is literally paving roads before the eyes of the nation. Even those who disagreed with Traoré's methods could not deny that he was delivering results that people could touch and see. For ordinary citizens, respect grew not because Traoré promised wealth overnight, but because he showed courage. In a world where many leaders seek comfort and approval from abroad, he chose the harder road. And the people recognized that choice. They saw that he was willing to face sanctions and criticism, so long as his people could stand taller tomorrow than they did today. The social fabric also began to change. Young men who once dreamed only of leaving for Europe now lined up for training programs to operate the new equipment. Families that had felt forgotten began to believe their sacrifices were building something lasting. Mothers told their children that even if life was difficult now, it was for the sake of a future filled with more opportunity. It is true that hardships grew, but with each trial, the spirit of the people grew stronger. Communities held fast to their faith, whether in churches on Sunday or in mosques on Friday. They reminded one another that dignity is not free. It comes at a cost, yet it is a cost worth paying, for it ensures that future generations can live without chains. What outsiders often failed to understand was that this struggle was not only about economics, it was about identity. It was about the right of a people to decide their own path. And in that struggle, families found strength in one another, and the nation discovered a unity it had long been missing. As the dust settled from that September morning, one truth stood clear. Burkina Faso had shown that dignity is more precious than gold, and that freedom is worth more than comfort. The machines were not only building roads, they were building confidence, faith, and a future that could not be bought with foreign loans. For the people of Burkina Faso, this moment was deeply personal. A mother could finally hope to reach a clinic in time. A farmer could carry his harvest to market without fear of loss. A young man could see a future at home instead of risking his life in distant lands. These are not statistics. They are the stories of families, of traditions preserved, of faith rewarded. But this story also reaches beyond Burkina Faso. It asks each of us a simple question. What does dignity mean to you? Is it comfort without freedom, or sacrifice with self-respect? For generations, Africa was told it could not rise without permission. On that September day, one nation answered with a firm voice, "We can build on our own." For those of you watching tonight, whether in Africa, America, or anywhere in the world, the lesson is the same. Justice, freedom, and dignity are not given. They are chosen, protected, and passed on to the next generation. Families understand this truth best, because every parent knows what it means to sacrifice today for a better tomorrow for their children. If this story touched you, do not let it end here. Share it with your family, your church, your neighbors, your community. Leave a comment with your thoughts about what dignity means to you. And if you want to keep walking with us through the stories of Africa's awakening, subscribe to this channel and join the conversation. May God bless Burkina Faso in her struggle, and may God bless all who believe that freedom is worth the cost.